I do believe you talked about Islamism, and I believe you talked about it in the Muslim world. I actually think it's infected almost the entire world. I believe we are suffering with it here. I think it was an insult that the president visited Morsi before he got around to visiting Israel. I think that...
Your question.
Oh, first of all, do you agree? And then... sorry. And I actually think... And do you agree that Europe is actually suffering from Stockholm Syndrome with regard to that? I mean, is my view too bleak?
Yes.
Okay. And why?
Several years ago, I spent the better part of a summer doing a fairly comprehensive survey of Islam in America. And it's worth sort of reprising what's said, because I think it's worth pushing back. And I'm not speaking of you, but there is a kind of fever swamp world that, we're Manchurian candidates, or I guess Manchuria is the wrong place. The Malaysian candidates or whatever are taking over. Look, first of all, Islam in America is a much healthier phenomenon than it is almost anywhere else, for a whole host of reasons, not the least of which is that a great majority of Muslims in the United States, first of all, they're not Arab. Second of all, they're much wealthier, they're professionals. Thirdly, there's just much less evidence of the kind of social stratification and isolation that you have in places like Paris or in Berlin. There's a great deal of civic consciousness there. The population is not as large as they often claim. The view that there are 6 million Muslims in the United States is probably an exaggeration by a factor of 2. So there's this sort of view that, oh my God, the Muslims are here and they're taking over, and it's just not true. It's just factually not accurate. And it also conflates two very different things. One is Islam, a religion, and the other is Islamism, a political program. And it's very important, I think, always to separate the two, because it's, I think, a slander against many millions of Muslims to conflate their religious views with their political views. In Europe, the situation is a little more severe, because Europe just never has had, well, Europe has a couple problems. One, it has a geographic problem, which is that the Muslim immigrants that it has don't come from, say, Istanbul. They come from Cappadocia. They come from the sort of hinterlands of Anatolia or of the Maghreb and so on. So there's that sort of basic issue. Second of all, the Europeans don't have or haven't had as an assimilationist model the way that the United States does. And so Muslim communities on the outskirts of Paris or in certain neighborhoods in Berlin have a kind of ghetto feeling to them. There are very few routes, relatively few routes to integration. I used to live in Brussels, and I lived on the edge of a large Muslim neighborhood, and it was, it was basically it was a dangerous neighborhood, and it was very sort of isolated and insular. And I don't think Europe has been able to come to grips with it, because what it tries to do is it likes to talk about multiculturalism without ever taking the sort of affirmative steps, if you will, to really start thinking about how they go about integrating this large community. Final point is a demographic one, which is that Europe has effectively net negative population growth, except in its Muslim communities. So there it will be politically a much more influential factor than it is in the United States, where demographic trends are somewhat different.
I really don't think it was properly understood, because what I was asking was, did the speaker think that there is a movement, albeit perhaps underground in this country, of Islamism, as opposed to, yes, all the law-abiding Muslim citizens that he then referred to, which, I have no argument with that. But I think there's something else going on that we need to pay attention to. Very subtle in some ways, very obvious in others. But I think it's happening. Just
an important distinction to make, which is Islam is a religion. Islamism is a political program which attempts to impose a version of religious doctrine on all and sundry. I think it's a fairly clear distinction, and I thought the woman who asked the question was basically saying, well, there are a lot of Muslims in this country, isn't that bad and worrisome? That's how I read the question. Maybe I misread it or read it unfairly, but I thought the distinction was worth making, and I think there are a lot of misperceptions about the Muslim community in the United States, a lot of excessive alarmism, and it's appropriate to be alarmed where there's reason to be alarmed. It's appropriate not to sound alarms where there are no clear reasons to do so. And I just thought her question raised that general topic, and I wanted to address it.
What is Islamism as a political movement, to your understanding?
Islamism is the Muslim Brotherhood, it's the Salafis, it's any group that believes that Islam is a political program that belongs in the halls of government as opposed to a religion that belongs in mosques.
Do you believe that there's that movement at stake domestically in the United States?
Well, clearly there are Islamist strains in the United States, just as there are everywhere. But the claim I was making is that I don't think they're the dominant strains. I think there's been a lot of hype. I mean, look, we shouldn't close our eyes to the fact that Anwar al-Awlaki had a Islamist and, frankly, terrorist mosque operation in Northern Virginia, which was at the time touted as a, quote, paragon of moderate Islam. So these things are real, but they have to be kept, they have to be dealt with a certain kind of perspective and fidelity to the truth, and an effort to be fair and sensible. And I often meet with young Muslim students at the Wall Street Journal, and I say, look, you know where I'm coming from, and you probably don't agree with my political views, but that's not the end-all and be-all of our common Americanness. And I think they took that quite well. So I am not one to hyperventilate about so-called Islamic encroachment in the United States.
But you don't deny that Islamism is a political movement at stake, at play.
Yeah, I do not like Islamism, and I have said so. I do not like a political movement that puts religious dogma at the center of its worldview. And I particularly don't like it because it expresses so much intolerance and of other religions, so much hatred of the United States. So I profoundly object to that. But in making that profound objection, I try to distinguish between what that is, a real threat, and I think what are often phantom threats. Great.
Are you familiar with groups like Council for American Islamic Relations?
Of course. Yes, of course.
So when their papers declaring their goal to turn America into an Islamic state, is that the Islamism that you were inquiring about on the panel?
Yes, absolutely. It's that kind of point of view that runs right beneath the surface, but it's there and it's growing.
Beneath the surface of what?
Beneath the surface of our society without being acknowledged. And we're all politically correct. We don't want to say that this is a religion that is imperialist, that wants Sharia law to be the law of the land, but we know that.
The law of America?
Every land, and the land...
Including America?
Agreed, yes.
No, I'm not asking.
Yeah.
You're telling me.
Okay. Yes, I believe so. I believe so. I certainly, when we're talking about CARE, and organizations like it, and people who associate themselves with it. But it's not something that is not something that's going to be stated directly, or certainly not for public consumption.
And where do Jews factor into political Islam?
Well, I don't think it's a very pretty picture for Jews. Jews are considered dhimmis, second-class citizens. I think we know that about Islamic countries now. So if a country was to be under Sharia law, I see no reason to think that it would be any different.
What's the goal for Israel? What's the Islamist goal for Israel?
The Islamist goal for Israel is complete destruction.
You mean to destroy the Jewish state of Israel?
That's correct. I think that's been clearly stated on a number of occasions, to drive the Jews into the sea.
And so the notion of a Palestinian state, do you suppose that would bring a peace to the Jewish state?
Wait, are you asking?
Would a Palestinian state be a peaceful neighbor given Islamists' goal to reconquer Jerusalem?
Now we're talking about two states side by side, and I don't believe that a Palestinian state would have any intention of long-term friendly relationships with Israel.
They could be cold neighbors, but would they be hostile neighbors?
Well, I think so far they've proven to be hostile neighbors, so if past is prelude to the present or the future, then I think we need to pay attention to that.
But if they had a peace compact or a treaty between them?
It's possible. It's possible, especially if financially they start to do better, and if their society starts to do better when they realize that two states actually can be something positive for them. It's possible.
Saudi Arabia is doing well financially. Why did they hate Israel? What does their economic condition have to do with whether they'll love Israel or be friendly with Israel?
It's hard for me to answer that question right now because I went to the Saudi session, and there is a lot of behind-the-scenes, collaboration between Saudi and Israel.
Because they have a mutual enemy in Iran.
That's correct.
But aside, if Iran were eradicated, what would Saudi Arabia then turn their goals against?
Well, Saudi Arabia is at the current time, as far as I know, in the process of building 16 nuclear reactors, which is enough to not only provide nuclear energy, but to also provide nuclear weapons. So that is very concerning.